know what Aviator90 is, Aviator90 is a 90-day, 45-part video tutorial course for flight simulator. So if you want to learn lessons from a real pilot on how to fly better within Flight Simulator, this course is a must. The first thing that you need to learn as a virtual pilot is what makes aircraft fly. The magic word we're looking for here is called lift. The first thing that comes to mind for me when thinking about lift is simply lifting a box or some other object. It means the object comes up. Lift is a phenomenon that allows an airfoil, like a wing, to take flight. Although not all wings are created equal, they all create lift with basic principles. Now, the push theory says that as the pitch or angle of attack of a wing is increased, the more it forces down the air underneath it, pushing the air down and therefore pushing the wing up. This is the simplest way to explain lift. Although this is simple, it is actually based on Sir Isaac Newton's third law of motion. I'm sure you've heard it before. To every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Many people fear stalls because, well, it's basically a situation where the aircraft isn't producing enough lift to want to continue flying and it essentially falls. With that said, it's not something you should be experiencing unless you are practicing, so you won't experience it in everyday flying. The technical explanation of a stall would be to say that once the airfoil angle of attack reaches its critical angle, it can no longer create enough lift to keep the aircraft flying, and unless that angle of attack is reduced, you will stall. Without delay, let's dive right in and check out the short field takeoff. So here's the scenario. Say you're at a fairly short airstrip and you also have an obstacle to climb over. Say it's 50 to 75 feet tall. Trees maybe? I don't know. This is a very nerve-wracking situation. So for this takeoff, we're going to use one notch of flaps, which is 10 degrees. We'll use full power, hold the brakes, and release when we're ready to let her rip. We'll rotate the aircraft right at our safe takeoff speed, and then we'll climb at VX, which is our greatest angle of climb. And in this aircraft, that is 55 knots. Now we are going to do some actual flying, but first, like any good pilot, you need to have some sort of a plan. Or do you? To a certain extent, you must have a plan, but planning doesn't have to be as difficult or as involved as you may think. Sometimes a plan can simply consist of a certain amount of fuel you know you have and a direction that you want to go, and that's it. Pretend for a moment that we have a perfect flight plan. All the corrections are done, perfect performance calculations, and so on. This flight plan is planned down to each and every foot and every tenth of a gallon of fuel. The cons of a method like this would be it takes a really long time to come up with a flight plan like this. The weather, winds, and performance are more often than not different than the reports and what the manual says. Focusing on the numbers too much will get you as an aviator fixated on flying a perfect flight, which actually doesn't exist. ATC can completely change your plan at any time. There could be an unexpected turn of events that tosses your whole plan aside. Or you get lost. Whether you get lost trying to find your waypoints or what, you got lost and now your whole plan literally flew out the window. So here is what we do need to plan for when flying somewhere, in summary. And this is generally always the case. 1. Weather. You need to know if the weather during your departure, en route, and destination will be fairly clear. You also need to have an idea of what the winds are doing. 2. General direction of flight, navigational aids you'll be using, or a log of visual waypoints you'll use. 3. Performance. You'll need to be familiar with each airport and what will be required for takeoff and landing performance. Too short of a runway and you won't be able to get off in time. If the area is too hot, humid, or high in altitude, the aircraft will also get degraded performance. Anyway, you need to know what you can and cannot do. 4. Fuel planning. You need to know what you can do with the fuel you have. The most important number we're looking for is your endurance, or how long you can stay in the air. With fuel planning, it's always smart to also have a reserve of fuel. For me, I actually consider my reserve time to be unburnable. In other words, I will never burn that fuel from my tanks on purpose. It's very important to have that safety buffer with fuel. So what happens if you get lost? What are some things you can do as an aviator to assist you in this particular situation? It turns out that there is a very simple way to get found when you are lost. This can be done in 5 simple steps called the 5 C's. It's hard to confess to yourself that you've screwed up and the situation has gotten beyond your control. So rather than continuing on, making things worse, and looking for answers that aren't there, confess to yourself that you are in fact lost. Climb. Climbing can be an important step because if we are lost, then we don't know what the terrain is in the area. This means that we must climb to a safe altitude. Now, it could also be argued that you can't know your safe altitude if you're lost, but chances are you're pretty close to where your original route was that you can make a pretty good guess. So guess on the side of caution and climb higher if needed. Conserve is one of the biggest ones here. If you're lost and you don't know where you are, then all of your fuel calculations just went out the window. So you won't be completing your flight unless you were already close to your destination. So chances are you have some fuel to use. Communicate. Air traffic control can help you out a ton. If you don't know their frequency in your area, usually you can call something called Flight Watch, which basically has a flight service station or other radio operators tuned in. Although this frequency may be different in other countries, it is 122.0 here in the United States. These people can assist you in getting in touch with ATC, where you can then hopefully get a radar ping so they know where you are and they can help you get out of there with a radar vector or something of that nature. So the last C is comply. Once you are done with the first 4 C's, it's important to comply with what ATC says as long as fuel permits, and then tackle that plan of action. So that does it for the 5 C's. Basically, what you want to do is go through that progression, get found, conserve fuel, climb, do what you need to do, and then get to safety and get your bearings and get all set for the next flight where I'm sure you would be more prepared. Before we jump in the cockpit and take this bad boy for a spin, I'd like to introduce you to the cockpit and give you a brief overview of everything in it. We are going to go from the top to the bottom, left to right, like we're reading a book. Lining the top of the instrument panel is the glare shield, which reduces the glare from the sun and also helps encompass all of the instruments. On the left side of the instruments, we find what we call the Basic 6. These instruments are what is used in basic instrument flight, as they give us all the indications we need to fly correctly, even when we can't see outside. Top left is the airspeed indicator. We'll go over the many aspects of this instrument throughout the training, but keep in mind for now that there is more than meets the eye. To the right of the airspeed indicator is the attitude indicator. This indicator is central to everything we do and the most important of all the instruments. Time for the takeoff episode. I'll do my best to explain takeoff technique for you, and hopefully you can take that knowledge into your own sim. Before we taxi onto the runway, we're going to do the lights, camera, action checklist. Lights, we're simply going to turn on the strobes and landing lights. Although strobes aren't on this aircraft, strobes are used for the duration of the flight from taxiing on the runway until we get to our destination and pull off the runway. So runway to runway. The landing lights will turn off when we leave the pattern and when it makes sense. Now, the camera is when we turn on our transponder. A transponder allows ATC to get our information so they can track us. Hold the brakes firmly and fully, and ease the throttle forward. Bring the engine up to full power and monitor the engine instruments and listen to the sound of the engine for a few moments. No problem, so release the brake, keep light forward pressure on the yoke, and keep on track with that center line with rudder input. Now, the plane will want to pull left quite a bit, so you'll have to counteract that. Keep on that center line and start to release pressure on the yoke. Now 55 knots is coming up, so smoothly ease back on the yoke and unstick those wheels. Sometimes it may take just a tiny and quick jerk to get the wheels off the pavement. Alright, you're airborne. Now adjust your pitch up and down to maintain our climb of VX, which is 55 knots, so maintain that same rotational airspeed. Nose down, you'll go faster. Nose up, you'll go slower, so adjust accordingly. First off, let's just fly straight and level at full power. This is generally your cruise situation. So in a small aircraft like a 152 or 172, you're going to simply be at full power most of the way, as long as we don't go past the red line on the tachometer. As you can see, we get pretty good airspeed out of the aircraft when we aren't climbing, just a nice steady pace. I'm now going to smoothly pull the power back to where the engine is idle. You'll notice without touching the controls, just the throttle, the aircraft has a tendency to pitch down and lose altitude. Now if I was to add back pressure, you can see that the airspeed is really starting to bleed off. Once we reach the bottom part of the white arc on the airspeed indicator, this is a good indication we are about to go into a stall. This time we'll be talking about turning and why it's not as simple as just turning the yoke. This episode is pretty simple, however, but it's essential to your growth as an aviator. You'll notice that we are losing a bit of altitude. What was once a stable and level flight is now losing altitude. Why, you ask? Well, when an aircraft turns, it loses a bit of its lift, and it has an increased load factor. Without going into too much detail, let's just say that the greater your bank angle, the less lift you are producing, and the greater your load factor. There will come a time, if you turn too much, that the aircraft just won't want to climb anymore and it'll want to roll and or dive. Now that's at least a story in a wee little Cessna like we have here. So to counteract this loss in lift, you can simply add light back pressure on the yoke. It won't always be the same amount, as that'll depend on your bank angle, but adjust accordingly to maintain your altitude. This time we'll be learning how to flare. Now, I can't promise that you'll get a nice and smooth landing every time, but I can promise that if you are an inexperienced virtual aviator, you're about to get some great tips on how to smooth out that final part of the landing, the flare and touchdown. Now, last episode we talked a bit about how a stable approach is essential to a good landing. Why, you ask? Well, if you're going too fast on the approach, you're really going to float in the flare, missing your touchdown point and just screwing up your overall flying mojo. So, stay on speed during the approach. You can pick a target on the runway. This line here works great, and if you're at an airport where the runway doesn't look like this, just work it out. Just promise me you won't clip any fences or take anyone's head off. You are more than welcome to pull out the power as long as you are on track with your touchdown point. So do it smoothly. Don't just cut it out. It'll make the transition a bit too aggressive. So if you do it smoothly, it'll be a nice transition that you'll be able to control. You want to do it quickly, but don't just yank the power. Today we are going to discuss point turns, which builds upon S-turns, which we did last episode. First, what is a point turn? Well, it's really simple. It's basically all visual, and we are simply choosing a landmark, say a tower, and we are going to circle around it. Now, this may sound simple, but we'll need to compensate for wind, continually adjust our bank angle, and maintain altitude without really focusing in the cockpit or with our eyes forward. This can be a task, but it is a lot of fun. So let's jump right in and try it out. First, we want to pick a landmark. There's a radio tower right over here that looks quite nice, so let's set a course to intercept that. Now we want to circle just under a mile out, or your typical runway length. And the closer you are to the object, the greater the bank angle it'll take to turn around it. So if you're too far away, it'll be a very long process, so we want to be somewhere in between. So here we are coming up on the tower. You can see it right over the airspeed indicator right now. There are some strobes on the top, and I'll peek around here, and we're going to use the left one. It's a little bigger, and that way it'll just be a little easier to visualize this. So I'm starting about a mile out, and it'll take practice to kind of figure out how far away you need to be. So we're going to pick a heading, start there, and do a 360-degree turn at a 45-degree bank angle. We'll roll out and meet our initial heading after that 360-degree turn, and immediately initiate a steep turn in the other direction. Sound fun? Well, just wait. We will be talking about 3 genres of navigation. These are dead reckoning and pilotage, VORs and ADFs, and GPS. In today's world, these are about the only types of navigation worth mentioning for general aviation. So let's get into it.
Alright, so there's some sources you can use for a flight simulator to do some flight planning. One great one I like is checkwx.com, checkwhiskeyxray.com. And what that is a website where you can pull up weather for any airport really quick. You can get an idea of what the weather will be like there. That's very nice. I really like real-world weather when I'm flying in Flight Simulator there for a program like Active Sky, which you can find at hifisim.com, or Real Environment X, which you can find at...
So obviously, an engine fire isn't just going to happen when you know it's going to happen. It's going to be something that comes very suddenly, and you need to know exactly what to do. Now, our first priority is to get that fire out, and an engine fire means that there's probably fuel burning up there or something else. It also probably means that your engine is destroyed and no longer reliable. So that means we are going to have to also make more than likely an off-airport landing. Alright, there's the fire, pull power, pull mixture, and now you are going to dive to the red line of the airspeed. All the way to the red line to try to put out that fire. The rushing air is the best thing to put out the fire. So keep diving right at that red line, keep that red line, and try to get that fire out as soon as possible. Alright, the fire is out now. We can pull up and we can recover a bit. I can even balloon and use that airspeed to climb a little bit. I'm going to close the vents here so I'm not getting any more of that bad air from up front. The side window's open for ventilation. Alright, we climbed a little bit. That helps. And now I turned off the fuel, so no more fuel will go to the engine. And I see an airport off to the right, but I really don't think I can make that airport, so I'm going to land straight ahead on the beach. I think that's the safest bet here. Because last episode we talked about lift, I find it appropriate to talk about weight. Weight is the opposite of lift. Out of all the forces, I consider this to be the simplest of the forces of flight because it has a few key aspects that we are both familiar with. First, a plane is not lighter than air, therefore it'll fall without the lift component. Second, gravity. We all know what this is, and thank goodness for it. Otherwise, this whole flying thing just wouldn't mean anything to us, because everything would be off the ground all the time anyway. In all seriousness, gravity is obviously the biggest contributor to weight. You can see why it's opposite to the force of lift. Thrust can be described in general terms as the force that moves the aircraft forward. This force largely relies on Newton's third law, again, as you'll see. we'll be using a propeller in the aircraft we'll be flying in Aviator 90, so let's talk about how the propeller creates thrust. A propeller turns at a rate determined by the pilot as a result of engine power. The prop is at a pitch or angle of attack, just like the wing we discussed in the lift section. The propeller essentially creates lift forward rather than up. This pulls the aircraft forward and also sends a blast of air back that assists a bit with airflow over the control surfaces. If an aircraft produces enough thrust to outperform drag, and we have a sufficient airfoil, the aircraft will fly. Drag is generally described as the forces upon the airplane that are pushing it back. These forces are basically friction, disruption, and resistance to airflow created by the forward thrust the aircraft is creating. Drag is broken up into several different types, which are friction, form, induced, and parasite drag. We'll now talk about each one of these. Friction drag is caused by the airflow around the airplane. As the air goes around the airplane, it comes in contact with the aircraft and creates friction as it touches. This in turn creates drag. Form drag is actually something we're all familiar with, as it is very prevalent in car designs. It is basically how the shape of the aircraft interacts with the air flowing around it. Now, a sports car will be built in such a way that form drag is reduced. Smooth, sleek, and with the least resistance possible. Aircraft, as you can imagine, are built in the same way. You don't see a big Vanagon flying around now, do you?
That is pretty much it. So I am going to show you some cool cloud formations here and maybe talk for a few more seconds. So let's look at this and talk for a few more seconds here. Just the brightness here. How cool is that? What a beautiful day to fly. Now, the funnest part about instrument flying would be the approaches, and that's challenging because it takes a lot of precision, a lot of work, and a lot of skill. And that is one thing that I will certainly teach you in Aviator Pro. Anyway, so this is the type of thing that you can fly, learn to fly with Aviator Pro, and it'll be a great experience for all of us. So that's it for me. I'm not going to show my face again. It'll just be out of focus.
Thank you.
So that's it. And that is it for Aviator 90. It's been a blast. So let's keep having fun and let's do Aviator Pro. Until next time on Aviator Pro, throttle on.